Hello guys and welcome to the Import-Export Hub channel. Bogdan here, your not so boring host for the next couple of minutes. And guys, without anything else to add in this intro, I will cut to the chase here and dive into the imports and the exports of South Korea for 2020, but not before kindly asking you to hit those tiny little subscribe and like buttons below this video. And as usual, I will start with the imports and export flows in order to see together who are the main drivers, and then I will focus on the top 5 drivers for each flow, and where possible I will try to give you some insights about what products drive South Korea's imports or exports towards or from a particular country. And with this being said, let's see together how this former Asian tiger did in 2020 in terms of exports. And basically, with its $513 billion worth of exports, South Korea is in a very select circle of export-oriented countries behind the Netherlands and in front of Italy, which puts South Korea on the 7th spot in terms of overall export performance worldwide. As expected, 2020 was a year in which the exports shrunk, and we have here a 5% contraction in relation with the figures of 2019, with chapters 85, 94, and 87 driving almost 55% of the exports, while the top 10 ones have an 82% cumulative share, which is very concentrated and, if you ask me, potentially dangerous. Among these top 10 drivers, we have plastics, mineral fuels, organic chemicals, and of course, let's not forget about the shipyards in South Korea, which until last year, they were number one in terms of new builds, a position now taken by China, just for information. Relative to the trend, and I don't know, because we're talking here about some industries in which South Korea's manufacturers are already recognized and quite old, if you ask me. My guess is that South Korea somehow reached a plateau in terms of total exports, and I don't think that the absolute and inflation-adjusted exports will reach anytime soon the values from 2018 or 2017 even. And of course, if you correlate this with the aging population of South Korea, a big red flag, by the way, for the majority of weird countries, well, big problems lay ahead. But anyways, this is not a macroeconomic course, of course. It's just a personal and biased opinion of mine, as I like to call it. So I'll now review very quickly the year-on-year changes and basically except the 4% increase for chapter 85. For the rest of the top 10 ones, we have big contractions ranging from minus 1% to minus 40%, as in the case here with the mineral fuels and mineral oil sector. So chapter 27. And guys, with this being said, I will now move on to the import flow, and we see that these were also down 7% in relative terms, to be exactly, with big contractions in the mineral fuels and oil sector, or iron and steel one, so chapter 72. As for the main drivers, chapter 85 is leading, followed by chapter 27. And on the third place, we have chapter 84. So basically machinery, mechanical appliances, and so on, with almost 12.3% share in South Korea's total imports for 2020. Other big import drivers are ores, of course, needed for the metallurgical sector, organic chemicals, and pharmaceutical products, with close to $7.8 billion worth of imports. And before moving on to the first chapter from the export flow, I will cover briefly South Korea's balance of trade, which is positive, meaning that it is exporting more than it is importing, with a big positive balance of trade for chapters 85, 87, and 39. And on the other hand, and again limiting myself only to the top 10 chapters, chapter 27, so mineral oils and fuels, chapter 26 and chapter 30 all have negative balance of trade, which is of course understandable as South Korea is dependent on energy imports, and it seems that also the pharma sector. But if you ask me, $1 billion negative balance of trade for this sector is really peanuts. So anyways, with the import flow being also covered, I will now move on to the South Korea's top 5 export drivers, and I will begin with chapter 85. So electrical machinery, mobile phones and integrated circuits, let's face it, which performed well, if you ask me, the only sector, in fact, with a year-on-year positive change. We have here a 3.93% increase in relative terms and some $159.6 billion in absolute ones. And we have China, Vietnam, and Hong Kong as the main export destinations, but there are other important ones like, I don't know, the United States, Japan, or Germany, for example, although these last two imported less in 2020 than they did in 2019. Now, in terms of year-on-year change, except Hong Kong, Japan, Germany, and India, who all had smaller import values, with the rest of the trading partners, we have positive values ranging from 5% to almost 45%, as in the case here with Taiwan. As for the main drivers, well, for Vietnam, we have HS code 851770, and for India, we have HS code 854232, so electronic integrated circuits. Now, moving on to South Korea's second biggest export drivers, so chapter 84, we see that this shrunk with some 4% compared with the figures from 2019. With China, the United States, and Japan the main export destinations, which make up for roughly 50% of all South Korea's exports from this chapter. So again, if you ask me, this sector is heavily concentrated in terms of export destinations. Relative to the year-on-year changes, the biggest relative change was in relation with Hong Kong, which imported almost 32% more. And on the other side, the biggest fall, again in relative terms, was in relation with Kazakhstan, which imported 33% less in 2020 than it did in 2019. As for the main drivers here, we have HS code 847330 for the exports towards the United States and HS code 841940, so distilling or rectifying plants, as in the case with Kazakhstan. Now, guys, moving on to the next chapter, which is chapter 87. Here, the drop in the exports was harsher. We have here almost 14% shrinkage compared with the figures from 2019, with the United States, Canada, and the Russian Federation representing the biggest export destinations. But there are other important ones in this top 10 list, like, I don't know, Australia, the United Kingdom, Mexico, or Saudi Arabia. But we see here that besides Canada, who imported with almost 5% more, with the rest of them we have big contractions ranging from 0.4%, minus 0.4% to minus 35%, as in the case here with Mexico. Anyways, the United States, which is the most important market, and of course, given the context, 2.2% drop is not the end of the world, if you ask me, for Hyundai Motor Corporation. And from my personal point of view, this is a success rather, as the North American market, so both the United States and Canada, performed pretty well, and my guess is that the low-medium income drivers from both the United States and Canada will focus even more on small engine sizes with better fuel efficiency, of course. So I see good times ahead for both Kia and Hyundai in the North American market. And guys, speaking of cars, well, there is no brainer here that these are the main drivers for both the exports towards Canada and the Russian Federation. And with this being said, I will now move on to the fourth biggest export chapter for South Korea, which is chapter 39, so plastics and articles thereof. And we see that even though the exports shrunk, this is quite a stable export sector for South Korea, as the absolute figure from 2020 is very close to the previous 4-year average export figure, which is somewhere around $31.6 billion. In terms of export destinations, well, China is by far the most important one, followed by Vietnam, and we have on the third place the United States. And relative to the year-on-year changes, except with China and Poland, who both imported more, with the rest of the trading partners, we see a lot of red, so contractions ranging from -1% to -18%, as in the case here with India. As for the main drivers, I will not embarrass myself to read the descriptions, so I will read only the HS codes. And we have HS code 392062 driving most of the exports toward Japan, and HS code 392119 driving most of the exports towards Poland. And guys, now that I've managed not to embarrass myself too much, I will now move on to the fifth and last chapter for the export flow, which is chapter 27. And basically in this sea of red, there is not much to say really. We have some 40% drop in exports. China, Japan, and the United States, we see here that are the main export destinations. Medium oils and preparations are the main export drivers, both towards Australia and Malaysia. We see here that the exports are heavily concentrated on Australasian countries. I don't know if this is a word even, but anyways, you got the idea, as I will now move on to the top 5 chapters for the import flow this time. And I will begin with chapter 85, and basically we see how the imports went up almost 5%, bringing the absolute value to some $94 billion, with China, Taiwan, and Vietnam representing the top 3 trading partners, and except Vietnam and the United States, with the rest of the top 10 trading partners, we have positive changes ranging from 3.5% to almost 50%, as in the case here with Singapore. And relative to the main import drivers, well, we have integrated circuits as memories coming from China, and integrated circuits as processors and controllers coming from Singapore. And guys, with this chapter also being covered, I will move on to the second biggest import driver for South Korea, which is chapter 27, which not surprisingly shrunk 32% in 2020 relative to the previous year. And we have what else here? I don't know, big petroleum and exporters and processors as main trading partners. And here I will name just a few, and we have Saudi Arabia, the United States, the Russian Federation, Kuwait or Qatar, and Indonesia, who is a big coal exporter, as you can see here in the main drivers column. Again, not that much to cover here, no overly complicated supply chains, just bulk shipments and huge refining facilities and storage facilities. So I will move on to the third biggest import driver, which is chapter 84. And we see that these two had a year-on-year positive change, 11% to be more precisely, and some $57.3 billion if we're talking about absolute values. And here again we see how China is dominating basically the exports from this chapter towards South Korea. On the second place, we have Japan with some $9.7 billion worth of exports. And on the third place, we have the United States with some $8 billion worth of exports towards South Korea. Now, relative to the year-on-year changes, and of course, limiting myself to these top 10 trading partners, except Germany, who had a 3% contraction, the rest of the countries exported more, and we see how the Netherlands, for example, most probably thanks to ASML Holding, exported in 2020 with almost 118% more than it did in 2019. Thanks, of course, to the machines needed for the manufacture of semiconductor devices, which, as I've said it, ASML Holding from the Netherlands, it's a worldwide player, and its share, if you look at it, skyrocketed during the pandemic. And speaking of drivers, for Taiwan, the main export driver towards South Korea is HS code 848630, so machines for the manufacture of flat panel displays, so television screens and monitors basically. And guys, with this sector also being covered, I will move on to the fourth biggest import driver, which is driven by Chapter 90, and we see together that this one too grew almost 5%, bringing the absolute import figure to some $19.4 billion. And we have here the United States, Japan, and China, the top 3 trading partners. But of course, there are other important ones in this top 10 list, like, I don't know, Germany, Taiwan, or Israel, just to name a few. Now, in terms of year-on-year changes, except Germany, and we see here also Vietnam, from which South Korea imported less. With the rest of the trading partners, there are positive changes ranging from 0.15% to 53%, as in the case here with Israel. And guys, speaking of Israel, the main driver, import driver for South Korea in 2020 was HS code 903141, so optical instruments for inspecting semiconductor wafers. As for the other example here, so Malaysia, the main import driver for South Korea was HS code 903082, so again related to the measuring of semiconductor wafers, but in this example we have instruments and apparatus. And guys, with this being said, I'll now move on to the last chapter from the import flow, so bear with me just a little bit more, guys. And we have chapter 87, so vehicles and parts thereof. And we see that the performance is quite good, if you ask me, with some 9% increase in relative terms, bringing the absolute value of South Korea's imports for 2020 at around $18.2 billion, with Germany, the United States, and China representing the top 3 trading partners. But there are other important ones like, I don't know, Japan, Sweden, or France, again, just to name a few from this top 10 list. Now, relative to the year-on-year changes, we have some contractions in relation with Japan, the United Kingdom, Sweden, and France here, while with the rest of the top 10 partners, we have positive changes ranging from 6%, like in the case with Austria, to 115%, as in the case with Slovakia, as Hyundai Motor Corporation has a big manufacturing plant there. And we see this in terms of what drove the exports from Slovakia towards South Korea as well. As for the main driver for the imports coming from Mexico, well, it comes as no surprise to see that from Mexico's manufacturing plant, they are importing gearboxes and the parts thereof to be mounted, of course, in the South Korean plant. And guys, with this last chapter being covered, my time is up. Thank you all for watching. Don't forget to hit the like and the subscribe buttons. And of course, until next time, keep your business safe. Thanks.